Evening, everyone, and welcome to Rethinking How We Regulate Big Tech, hosted by the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge in partnership with StateUp. It's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. My name is Tanya. I am founder and director of StateUp, and I lead the Digital State project at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. Many of you will know that the Bennett Institute sets out to address some of the most fundamental and critical problems in public policy in and for the 21st century through its multidisciplinary research. And StateUp provides advisory, data, and training services focused on public purpose technology with the aim of bridging the gap between the worlds of government and technology to improve citizens' lives. So tonight's discussion is very much at the intersection of the work of both. Now, big tech regulation is one of those topics that within a very short period of time has come to feel quite polarized and often somewhat stagnated as a topic of conversation. And yet, at the same time, the stories of misinformation, of privacy breaches, of labor exploitation, and even just of strange company cultures grows every day and has become increasingly normalized, I think, within our media discussions as well, which makes it, I think, more urgent than ever for some of our most creative and pragmatic experts and thinkers to be providing new ways of thinking on technology regulation. So I'm particularly excited today to be joined by 4 experts who are doing just that in their work at the moment. And I think an absolutely exemplary example of this fresh thinking is a book whose launch we're also celebrating this evening, Good Data, An Optimist's Guide to Our Digital Future, new work by Sam Gilbert, one of our speakers this evening who I'll introduce in a moment. And the book does a brilliant job of moving beyond some of the tired arguments to instead really think about the potential benefits of good data usage and about how to create the governance mechanisms that might enable us to reap some of those benefits. And we'll be hearing more about the book, I hope, this evening. Before I formally introduce our speakers, I do just want to mention a few little pieces of housekeeping. The first is just to mention that this event is being recorded, but attendees can be neither seen nor heard, so don't worry too much about that. The recording will be posted across social channels, so you'll be able to catch it there as well. We're also going to absolutely make sure that there's time for questions. I'm sure there'll be plenty of them. So please do think about what you'd like to ask the panel. And to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And please do include your name. And if your organization is relevant to the conversation, then feel free to add that too. And we will try to come to as many questions as possible. Finally, and all importantly, we will be using Twitter this evening. We will post a hashtag and various Twitter handles that you might want to include if you decide to join the conversation there, and I hope you will do. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this evening. Each is going to begin by speaking for about 5 minutes and to give us a mini keynote presenting one really important way in which they believe we need to rethink big tech regulation, and that will start our conversation for the evening. So by way of introduction, we have Sam Gilbert, who is both an entrepreneur and an affiliated researcher at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, and as mentioned, author of the recently published Good Data. We have Dr. Amanda Green, who's a lecturer in political philosophy at UCL, Jamie Suskind, a barrister at Littleton Chambers and also an affiliated researcher at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy, and Professor Diane Coyle, Bennett Professor of Public Policy at that very same institute. So I'm going to hand over to Sam now to kick off our keynote.
Well, thank you, Tanya, so much for that very kind introduction. So I thought I would kick us off by talking about something which I think captures in microcosm why we need to rethink big tech regulation when it comes to privacy. And that something is app tracking. App store opt-in consent from users to track their online activity and to share data with third parties. So effectively what that does is change the default for iPhone and iPad users when it comes to targeted digital advertising. And whereas before everybody was opted into targeted advertising by default, now everybody is opted out by default. And perhaps unsurprisingly, since Apple rolled out this change, only a very small minority of users have chosen to opt in to receive ads that are targeted. And that's led to a lot of speculation that this may actually be the beginning of the end for targeted digital advertising. And I suppose a lot of the time when we think about issues of technology and of privacy, our thinking at the moment is very much shaped by things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal and by Shoshana Zuboff's very influential book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And probably what we've taken from that is a narrative that says targeting is bad and privacy is good. And as a result, there's probably a lot of people who are sympathetic towards what Apple has done on the basis that it's upholding the privacy rights of individuals at the expense of the commercial interests of organizations like Facebook and Google that benefit from targeted digital advertising as their business model. But what I want to try and persuade you is that there are also some costs and some downsides to app tracking transparency and to, I guess, more generally valorizing privacy, which we ought to take seriously. And so the first thing I want to say about that is that targeted ads can actually be socially useful. So targeting and tracking of advertising is important because it helps businesses allocate their budgets more efficiently and therefore to be more productive. But actually targeting most benefits smaller businesses. So this is local businesses, startups, makers. All of these types of businesses are enabled to find customers through targeted digital advertising. That's reflected in the fact that something like 7 million businesses use Facebook to advertise, more than 4 million businesses use Google. And while big spenders on digital advertising like Disney and Walmart might be able to offset the impacts of app tracking transparency by migrating budgets to television or direct mail, that's much harder for smaller businesses to do. So I guess those are the obvious economic downsides of app tracking transparency, but there are some other downsides that I think become clearer when we pause to reflect on Apple's strategic agenda. So I've got every reason to believe that Tim Cook and other executives at Apple do believe that stronger protections for data privacy are in the interests of their users, but I think it's also worth thinking about the context that they're operating in. So on both sides of the Atlantic, there's been a lot of interest from politicians and from regulators in antitrust. And when it comes to the app market, Apple effectively has a duopoly with Google. It's in a sort of the position of a gatekeeper because developers of mobile apps have no choice but to distribute their apps through the App Store or through the Play Store. And as a result of that, the developers have no choice over whether they accept or reject the rules that Apple and Google set. And they also need to pay 15 to 30% of their revenue in fees. So one of the ways that we could look at app tracking transparency is as a message that Apple is sending to regulators that the way that it is wielding this gatekeeping power is in individuals' interests. So another thing that we might consider is what the issue of privacy and app tracking transparency distracts attention away from. And in the case of Apple, it might well be that Apple doesn't want us to think so much about the hardware supply chain. So Apple devices get assembled in facilities like the Longhua factory, which belongs to the outsourcer Foxconn in Shenzhen. At the same time, Apple devices, as all digital devices, relies on rare earth metals and minerals like coltan and cobalt. And for the people who are working assembling devices and mining these minerals and metals, the conditions in which they work are not always safe even. So I guess the third thing to think about is the distributional consequences of this potential end to targeted digital advertising as the business model for the web, because there's this sort of underappreciated benefit that we get as a society from advertising being the web's business model. and that is that it effectively funds universal free services like search and social media for everybody in the world who has got a device and has got an internet connection. And that is most to the benefit, not of Apple users who tend to be more affluent people in more affluent countries, but it tends to be most to the benefit of users in the global south. So actually in Good Data, I analysed Facebook's 2018 financial results and found that effectively there is a transfer of $25 billion worth of value from users in North America and Europe to users in the global south as a function of Facebook funding its business model through advertising. And personally, I find it quite difficult to see how a change towards monetizing the web through subscriptions or through in-app payments can really preserve those positive redistributive benefits. So just to conclude, what I think I'd like you to take away is that when we encounter new policy ideas like app tracking transparency, maybe the best question for us to ask is not so much, is this good or bad, is this right or wrong, but instead, how does this affect relations of power? And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Amanda, who I think is also going to talk about power.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So I agree we need to rethink how we regulate big tech, but I'm going to suggest that we should start by taking a step back so that we can consider the sort of power that these companies are wielding and why that power might be problematic for society and maybe even illegitimate. So it's clear to, I think, all of us that big tech has a lot of power, but what's more important in my opinion is that they have a new kind of power that can't be modeled on the power of sovereign states or even on the power that individuals have over each other. So let's call this digital power. And I want to ask, if there is this new thing, digital power, what would make it legitimate? And I want to sketch an answer by sharing some thoughts that I've developed in collaboration with Sam Gilbert. So let's take the case of Facebook, the company. And here I'm thinking of their full suite of apps, the Facebook app, the Instagram, WhatsApp. So most of the time when power is being exercised on Facebook's apps, it's not being exercised by Facebook, nor is it being exercised by an agent that we would ordinarily think of as powerful, like a state or a corporation. Instead, it's being exercised by the app's users. Now, we've seen this kind of thing before, platforms. They're set up to enable a large number of people to interact more widely and with less friction. But there's something fundamentally different about social media platforms. And I'm going to argue that they don't just enable users, they empower them. So what does that mean? So Facebook has created the conditions for billions of people to do billions of things to each other, with each other, for each other. And they've facilitated this by providing new opportunities that are predicated on defining and assigning roles, where these roles have certain permissions. And so the new opportunities that are facilitated by Facebook emerge as a result of an environment that's designed for permissionless interaction. But in fact, there is an underlying permission structure. It's just that the permissions are minimally demanding and highly versatile in their usage. So when Facebook upholds this minimal and versatile permission structure, they're in effect facilitating the emergence of a huge range of activity that would otherwise not be possible. So I would actually compare Facebook to an institution that is an interlocking system of expectations that allow for cooperation and competition for a variety of purposes. And this leads in turn to empowerment and disempowerment, depending on the pattern of use, which is itself in flux. So the distinctiveness of companies like Facebook, I think, is not in how they concentrate power, but in how they create new power and distribute new power, thereby empowering others. So I'm going to call this empowering power. So what would it take for this kind of system to be legitimate? Well, I think it starts by us facing up to the fact that system designers have a responsibility for what they create, especially when their creations are characterized by runaway effects and lack of friction. And they have extra responsibility for minimizing the potential negative consequences. They should ensure that the benefits outweigh the risks of harm, and they should do this in a manner that's suitably responsive to the views of people involved. And I think that This means companies like Facebook should adopt a posture of a custodian, that is, a safeguarder or a kind of caretaker of a system, and make sure that they are safeguarding the integrity and usefulness of the system they've created, as opposed to orienting themselves primarily towards expanding it. And so for the companies themselves, that would mean exercising greater diligence in the release of new product features that might be used to inflict harm. And the companies should have more responsiveness when unexpected downsides of these new product features become clear. And for public policy, I want to say that this empowering power is so new and so distinctive that antitrust, data rights, and taxation, most of the policy proposals that have been put forward are not going to address it. So I can say more about this in the discussion, but just to give you 2 examples, some people are urging us to break these companies up on the model of antitrust, but this is not like breaking up railroads or telecom. If the number of user-generated content platforms increases, this does not necessarily mean that each one's reach and versatility decreases. And so the problem of empowering power remains because it emerges from the multiplicity of aims that Facebook's tools can be used to facilitate, and the inability of a system built on permissionless interactions to scrutinize the agenda of users. So breaking up these companies is not going to address this. On the other hand, some people are urging us to dial up the pressure on content moderation, and this could take several forms. One is to force moderators to be more responsive to democratic control by taking autonomy away from these companies. But in practice, this means the companies are going to be forced to heed the demands of any democratically elected government. And I think the way this has played out in India recently is cause for concern. Another way to dial up the pressure on their content moderation is through publisher liability. But I think realistically, the scale and the speed of moderation that would be needed to avoid liability can only be operationalized with artificial intelligence. And this is likely to result in over-policing of content by these tech companies. So stepping back and just to conclude, the larger point, I think, is that a lot of the policy recommendations on the table are seeking to control these companies and force them to behave in a certain way as though they were bad actors. But that's not what they are. They're less like tyrannical sovereigns and more like institutions with only a moderate degree of steerage as to how they're going to be used. So I think what's needed instead is a way to hold the institution responsible for the consequences of its use patterns as they are evolving. So we need mechanisms to hold the owners and the designers of these apps accountable for their own judgments about how to mitigate the potential downsides of their products without blocking the potential upsides of their products. And this sort of policy approach would reflect a better understanding, I think, of the new threats posed by digital power. And that has to do with the fact that it's an empowering form of power. So with that, I'll hand over to Jamie.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you, Sam, for your words as well. And thank you to the Institute for having me along today. The theme of my 5-minute talk is regulate people, not just systems. And I'll come on to that in a second. First of all, just to say a little bit about my work. I'm a practicing barrister in the courts here in England and Wales, but I also write at the intersection of politics and tech. My first book was called Future Politics, and I've just written another one called The Digital Republic, the subtitle of which is How to Govern Technology. So it's thrilling for me to be at an event today to hear all these new and brilliant ideas, many of which I wish I'd thought of and had put in the book, but it's a little late for that now. Regulate people, not just systems. I agree with Sam and Amanda that the fundamental problem that we're trying to tackle when we govern or regulate technology is power, and usually it's unaccountable power. And where does that power come from? Well, there are lots of different diagnoses. Lots of people point to the size of tech companies, the financial resources at their disposal, their influence on what might be called the conventional political process through lobbying and campaign finance and the like. But I say that the power of digital technology is different and fundamentally different because it comes in 3 different forms. And these forms inhere in digital technology itself. They're to do with the fact that it's technology. The first is that technologies contain rules that the rest of us have to follow. So if you imagine you're in a self-driving car and you wanted to go over the speed limit because you're rushing to the hospital, or you wanted to park in a bay that is reserved, or you wanted to drive across land that would be private land and therefore trespassing. That digital system might refuse to do that, in the same way that your computer won't grant you access if you don't have the right password. You can't get a computer system to do things that it's not otherwise programmed to do. And the fact that we now interact with digital systems in almost all of our daily activities, interactions, and transactions means that we are subject to the rules that those systems contain. And the people who write those rules have power to get us to do things that we wouldn't otherwise do and not to do things we would otherwise have done. That power might take the form of engineering and designing the algorithms that distribute important things like jobs or insurance or credit or a mortgage or housing. Or it might take the form of moderating a social media platform. Whatever it is, digital technologies can enforce their rules in a way that no previous king or prince or priest could have dreamt of. The second thing they do is that they gather data about us. Data can lead to power in two ways. First of all, the more others know about us, the easier it is to influence and manipulate. But also the fact that we know we're being watched, the data is being gathered about us, can make us police ourselves and control our own behavior without anyone needing to tell us yes or no. And of course, the third thing they do is that digital technologies stand between us and each other and between us and the rest of the world. They filter what we see of the world. And whether it's a search engine or a social media platform or a news algorithm, increasingly we rely on digital intermediaries to tell us what's going on, what matters and what doesn't matter, what's true and false and the like. And that shapes us quite profoundly. It determines what we want and what we care about, what we consider salient and what we think doesn't matter. And that's a form of power in itself, because it touches our soul as well as our bodies, it touches our minds too. So stepping back, those who own and control digital technologies have a growing amount of power. But what's strange is that we aren't yet treating digital technologies in the way that we treat other areas of society in which people have accrued responsibility and power to themselves. So if you think about people like doctors or lawyers or pharmacists or structural engineers or pilots, all of whom have a degree of specialist knowledge and are supposed to use that knowledge for the benefit of other people, they are all subject to particular rules and regimes which people in the technology sector, by and large, aren't. So why does, for instance, Facebook differ from a law firm? Well, to work at Facebook, there aren't any mandatory qualifications or diplomas or certifications that you need to have. There aren't even any shared norms governing your conduct. There's no industry expectation as to ethical or competence standards. There's no unitary industry body there to say whether you've fallen below those standards. There are no sanctions for wrongdoing when people get things wrong or make mistakes. And there's no requirement for ongoing professional development or training. So in all of these respects, working in the tech industry is power, like the traditional professions, but it's power without responsibility. People aren't answerable to an industry body or anyone else in the same way that people in the professions might be. Of course, they are answerable to some things like market forces and the whims and demands of their bosses, but those things don't always promote good behavior. In fact, professionalization is often meant to act against market forces, to get lawyers, for instance, to do the ethical thing rather than the profitable thing. So the reason I think it's important to govern people or regulate people and not just systems is that you can't hope to scrutinize every decision that's made on social media or every algorithm that performs an important social function. But what you can try to do, and by the way, I do think that such important systems should be subject to certification and rules and standards themselves. But in addition to that, what you can try to do is create a culture of people who want to do the ethical thing, and not only want to do it, not only see it as a question of ethics, but see it as a question of compliance. If I fall below a particular standard of competence or of ethical conduct in the powerful work that I do, then I should expect there to be consequences. A good example of this, and it's not a perfect system of regulation, but a good example is the financial services sector, for instance, in this country. So in this country, we have what's called controlled functions. There's a director function, a compliance oversight function, a money laundering reporting function. And if you do one of those functions within a bank or other financial institution, you are regulated by the British regulator, and you are expected to be and be able to prove yourself to be a fit and proper person to do that role. What roles in technology should be controlled functions? which algorithm designers or data scientists and engineers or or those who oversee moderation on social media platforms, which of those should be controlled functions which society says you shouldn't just be allowed to be left to yourself or left to market norms when you decide what is right and what is wrong. So in addition to traditional modes and mechanisms of governance and regulation, standards, certification, rules, and the like, applying to products and systems, I also think we should regulate people, because if you're going to assume great power, if we're going to accept that computer scientists are, that software engineers are increasingly social engineers too, then the responsibility should come with that power as well, just like it does in other sectors. And with that, I will pass over now to Diane.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Hard act to follow these three contributions. And Tanya started by saying this debate has got quite overwrought, and I do agree with that, because it's really a small number of companies and some state agencies that we're concerned about, because they have the power to make a big difference to our lives. And at the same time, people really greatly value these digital services that they don't directly pay for, and they create great potential for innovation. Jamie just said the fundamental problem is power, and I don't agree with that, actually. I think the fundamental problem is that we're having an inherently individualist debate, about an inherently collective context. And so the one thing that I want to talk about is data. I'm an economist, and data is what we would characterize as a non-rival good, or a public good, to use a technical term. It can be controlled technically, people can prevent it from having access to it, but it's not depleted. If somebody uses it, the same data can be used over and over again. And the information provided by data, the thing that makes it useful, is almost always relational. So for example, to know one of my health indicators, my temperature or my pulse rate, doesn't give me any useful information unless I know what the population norms are. My spending pattern is useful information to the extent it's indicative of what people like me do as part of a different population. So my one big idea is to get away from talking about data as a personal thing, something that can be owned and controlled, whether by individuals or corporations, that individual consent is needed to prevent any kinds of, or give permission for any kinds of data use. I want to get away from this individualism and think about it in a societal context. Now that does take you to some regulations or interventions that do address issues of power. So take market power. The competition authorities are looking at the way that the big tech companies have accumulated and limit access to the very large stores of personal data that they have accumulated over the years. And one idea which I would support is to force the tech companies to enable access to that data through APIs, just as in the UK, the open banking regulation will make it possible for new entrants, fintech companies, to start to enter the market using that data that the big banks have already accumulated in just the same way that big tech has already accumulated. So there's a market power issue. We certainly, I think, need to understand better the way that data is being used to inform algorithmic decision-taking. There's some very well-aired issues about bias in that. I think we just don't really understand how those decisions are shaping up in the real world. One example, and again, it's from the realm of competition, is about the possibility that algorithms are colluding with each other because the way that they have been established to respond strategically to what other algorithms are doing. So that needs to be better understood and properly regulated. There needs to be monitoring and evaluation of outcomes in markets. Similarly, there are uses of algorithms, machine learning systems in some areas of state decision-making that really could have a very adverse impact on people's lives. So I'm thinking about things like facial recognition systems, or the use of algorithmic decision-making in criminal justice systems, or even quotes, less serious interventions like the exam grade fiasco here last year. So I think that kind of use of machine learning based on data should probably be paused in all of these domains where it could really have an adverse effect on people, until we understand better what data is being used, what biases are being embedded, and evaluate the kinds of outcomes that we can get from those, and that hasn't been done yet. But the thing that really concerns me, because of the way we think about data now as something that can be fenced off and whose access can be controlled, is that there are potential uses of data from it being joined up that could have enormous societal value. All kinds of innovations out there that are left on the table by this framing that we have of data as being an individual possession. So I would like us to switch the language about this and the regulatory approach to one of different entities, individuals, organizations, state actors, public sector bodies, having permission to access certain data for certain purposes. There's a concept of privacy in public, which social norms as well as regulation enforce in real life, so that I, as somebody who teaches students, need to know some things about them, but there are a lot of things, a lot of their information, their data, if you like, that is completely irrelevant to that relationship. Digital has brought down those boundaries, and we haven't established either regulations or social norms for that at the moment. And that, I think, is where I would like to concentrate. What are the rights of access? Who can access certain kinds of data? And beyond that, what kinds of data does that mean that we can then make more open, more able to be shared, and more able to create broad societal value? So, back to Tanya now. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you for those 4 outstanding points of view. Definitely have given us a lot of food for thought to start with. And please do add your questions to the Q&A, and we'll come to lots of them now. I want to start the conversation by thinking about a thread that I think has come up in each of the keynotes so far, which is really about the newness and distinctiveness of the digital world, and particularly digital power. At least in 3 of the talks, that was the kind of language used. And this newness leads me to wonder about who should be responsible for regulation and where capabilities actually lie to carry out this function. And, you know, we've seen that regulators are finding clamping down is sometimes easier said than done. We've seen some proposals recently, the EU's Digital Services Act, the UK's Online Safety Bill, that show that there is increasing scrutiny, but there have been setbacks along the way as well for regulators. And of course, a number of the companies would prefer to take a self-regulation approach, or perhaps advocate for oversight boards, both advocate and in fact have begun to use oversight boards that are self-appointed by the companies themselves, rather than relying on outside governance structures. Is this the right approach? Do regulators need to build their own capabilities, or is self-regulation and oversight boards the way to go? Sam, maybe we'll go to you first, and other speakers, please feel free to jump in along the way.
So thanks so much, Tanya. Such an interesting question to reflect on. So I guess maybe I'll start with a quick thought on the Facebook Oversight Board, which has got not such a good press, really. I think many people suspect it's simply a fig leaf and something that Facebook can use to disown its responsibility. I actually have probably a different attitude towards that, which is that before the creation of the Oversight Board, Mark Zuckerberg's personal power was essentially unchecked because he still controls a majority of Facebook's voting stock. So he really was a sovereign before that Oversight Board got created. So I guess in my opinion, we ought to welcome that specific move just because it means he and Facebook is at least now more accountable to an independent body than it was before. That's not the same as saying I think that self-regulation and oversight boards are the answer. And so just sort of another kind of reflection on the point you made at the beginning there, Tanya, which is relates to, I suppose, the kind of the skills and the knowledge that exists in regulatory bodies to effectively regulate digital technology companies where there's a lot of technical complexity. I think one thing I'd like to draw attention to is something Amanda and I have been discussing in our work, and this actually also connects to something Jamie said about the applicability of financial services regulation to the tech sector. And this thing is really the value of vague standards. So in financial services, there's a thing called treating customers fairly, or TCF, which I think when it was brought into UK financial services, everybody who worked in financial services, which included me at the time, really disliked because it was so vague. It effectively just said, as a financial services organisation, you have got a responsibility to treat your customers fairly, and you have to be able to provide evidence that you're doing that. But I think in practice, what it's meant is that financial services firms have become more engaged in thinking about what fairness means when it comes to financial services, and also in showing how they, or in making sure that they can show regulators that they are trying their best to be fair towards their customers. And so, Amanda, I don't know if you want to say more about this, but we've been thinking about whether the same sort of approach of a vague standard when it comes to technology companies might bring similar benefits.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in now just to follow up on that. I mean, I agree with all of that, and I can add a couple of thoughts. It's not clear to me what institution has the authority and legitimacy to regulate these companies. I mean, at the beginning, I think I said that I believe they have a legitimacy deficit. And I think they've been struggling to sort of figure out how to solve that problem. Initially, there was a sort of techno-utopianism that the internet is free and then norms will emerge through use over time. And so it will be kind of this self-governing realm. And that bubble has burst, obviously. And then the companies shifted towards saying we need the government to step in and come up with some regulations so that we're not it's not totally up to us. But then I think there was this recognition that maybe the governments don't know what to do either. So it seems to me like these companies are now taking it upon themselves, not necessarily to self-regulate collectively, but to at least start to present to the public the values that they take to be important in the rules that in the way that they behave and the way that they grow their companies. So just two sub-points on that. So I agree with Jamie that there's a lot of traction to be had in terms of individual responsibility. And there is a history of kind of professional ethics in engineering that we could capitalize on, like civil engineers for at least for decades have had sort of professional norms about fit and proper ways to do their jobs. So we don't even need to go to lawyers or doctors. We already have an engineering model. The thing is, though, that what's being engineered, it's not civil engineering, it's software design. And what's happening there is a design of what I call permission structures. And that seems to me like it requires some new thinking about what would individual responsibility mean when you're designing a permission structure whose potential use patterns are very hard to predict. And so here, maybe I'll just connect with something that Diane said about pausing things that we don't know. We don't know yet how bad the consequences could be. I think there's two sides to this. I'm going to sound like I spent time living in California, which I did, but there's things to be learned from experimentation. And so I wouldn't be in favor of a full precautionary principle that until we know all the bad stuff facial recognition can lead to, we should just pause it. For example, I'm not saying that's what you're suggesting, Diane, but I do know some people advocate this kind of strong precaution. I'm not sure that is going to lead to the quickest learning. The quickest learning might come from experimenting and seeing, on a small scale, what the bad consequences might be before allowing it to occur on a larger scale. So all of these points are kind of all of these observations and thoughts are bringing me to the position that there may be some new model of quasi self-regulation for these companies, maybe along the lines of journalism more so than being a lawyer or being a doctor or being an accountant, because journalism sees its responsibilities as political and social. And so there may be space, and in a way, I think this is what Facebook Oversight Board is grasping for, is like a way of showing that they care and are willing to be answerable to some agent who's thinking about the consequences for the public of their product. And they recognize that they will not have enough authority to make those decisions all themselves, but they also don't see right now an institution that has that authority. So they've had to make one up. So yeah, this is why I'm not sure we should be so quick to dismiss the idea in general of self-regulation as a broad category.
Just to briefly follow up, the exam question we were set was one big idea to regulate big tech. I think what's emerging clearly is there isn't a single answer. There won't be a single thing that you can do, and it will be a mix of new laws, new regulations, professional standards, different norms emerging. So more than one thing.
I was just going to add one observation, which is this. Diane, I'm not sure we are as far apart as perhaps it might appear from the way that we express ourselves about the fundamental problem. The issue I see, the question I think we need to ask is, who is it that should bear the responsibility and bear the burden of making sure that digital technologies, powerful ones, are safe and are generally used in conformance with society's values? And the answer that we currently give, as you identify, is that we leave it to individuals. We let individuals consent away their rights, with things like terms and conditions that they click 10 times a day, they don't read, they don't understand, they couldn't understand even if they did read. Decisions which affect other people and not just them, because if I give away all of my data, that affects people like me and not just me. And so we have this highly individualized response to what I would call the concentration of power, which is obviously inadequate. And what's happened in the past when we've had great concentrations of power is that we haven't said, let's let everyone pursue their own forms of resistance. We've asked people to join together. We've seen people join together in trade unions, for instance, to combat the power of large employers, rather than expecting individual workers to negotiate better terms for themselves one at a time. And I think the question we're asking here is, where should that responsibility be situated in society? And there are basically three options. We leave it to people, which is basically leaving it to the market, the individualized solution. I think that's shown itself not to be a success. We leave it to the industry is the second choice. And of course, by the way, most lawyers would say that they are self-regulated, but that's not what technologists mean when they talk about self-regulation. When people in Silicon Valley talk about self-regulation, they're basically asking to be left to get on with it. Facebook is an interesting exception in this regard. I'll talk about it in a second. But lawyers are self-regulating only in the sense that their governing institutions, and doctors are the same, are generally made up of doctors and lawyers. That's the sense in which they're self-regulating. But that doesn't mean if you're a naughty lawyer or a naughty doctor, you get to kind of mark your own homework. You will end up being punished and expelled from the profession or sanctioned if you cross a particular line. And that just doesn't exist just now in the tech industry. And it also doesn't feature in many forms of self-regulation that are described by the tech industry. The Facebook example is really interesting because it is the ultimate self-denying ordinance. They have introduced a system which purports to limit their own power. And the only thing I would say about it is that Facebook is the only company that's done it. And that is I'm sure there are other examples, smaller ones, but if you look at the big companies, Facebook is the only one that's done it. And that is obviously the glaring problem with it, that it was their choice. And actually, if you look at the scandals that have happened in Google, for instance, with their AI ethics team, with people being fired or allegedly for voicing concerns, for people having their research covered up and not properly published, you can see that not every, and as I recall, Google itself had an AI ethics board which was disbanded 2 weeks after it was formed because there were multiple conflicts of interest. The truth is, I'm not sure you can trust private sector companies always to do the right thing because they are because they're businesses with duties to their shareholders and to make profit, and that will usually come first. And so what you need to do, I argue, is have a collective solution where society generally sets down rules and standards and enforces them at a collective level. So I don't think people should be responsible for looking after their own rights. I don't think companies should be trusted to do it. I think, as in any other sector in society where huge power accrues to a particular industry, you come together through the organs of the state and you lay down laws and regulations.
I just want to reflect an additional subtlety to this conversation that's been added to the Q&A, which is we've been talking about the role of the regulator, if they should have one, in the singular. But Julie Pierce from the Food Standards Agency says, we're a regulator grappling with the sale of food on these platforms. What role should I have as a food regulator versus any of the other regulators who might be closer to these businesses as digital and technology platforms? And I think that's an important point to make, that actually there are a variety of different regulators, and there's something to be said also for thinking about how they potentially work together as well. I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that one, but we have many other questions also to reflect on. Anyone for that one?
Well, it's obviously a great point. We used to talk about the digital economy, but it's become like talking about the electricity economy because it's all digital. And so regulators clearly need to cooperate. Given the need for enough technical expertise among regulators, I think there is a case for, locating that in one or two of the bodies that we have. But that cooperation among regulators is going to be key.
Amanda talked in her response about the need for experimentation. And I think in no area is this clearer than in data sharing. And there is a lot of initial conversation about what data sharing practices might look like. Some initial attempts at doing this as well, but often quite small scale. And we have a couple of questions from the audience, from Elizabeth Oyer and from Bluebell Drummond, who are asking variations on a theme of what good data sharing practices might look like between sectors as well, whether we should be using an Estonia style digital database set that's accessible to various different entities, or whether there are other approaches that might take us in a positive direction as well in terms of making the most of the potential of shared data sets, whether they use data from government organizations or private organizations as well. Sam, I know this is one that you've thought about quite a bit in your book. Perhaps you want to kick.
Yes, so I have definitely thought more about the opportunity and the potential benefits of more data sharing rather than thinking so much about the technical solutions for it. But I guess maybe what I would do is come back to some of the points that I was touching on in my keynote, which is that I feel like if we put so much emphasis on privacy and on the risks of individuals being re-identified when data sets are created and aggregated, we are in danger of foreclosing on some of the social and public benefits we can unlock if we're willing to put more data rather than less data into the public domain. So perhaps I'll just leave it at that. Like, I really feel like openness with data, whether that's openness with government data to enable innovations like CityMapper, for example, which is predicated on governments all around the world making transport data available, openness with data that we might regard as being personal to us. So one example I really like of this is the work by Raj Chetty and the Opportunity Insights team in Harvard, where they've used anonymized tax records information to generate objective insights into what's going on with social mobility in America. That has huge social and public benefits of the type Diane touched on in her keynote. And whatever the technical solutions are to enable this, these things, these are the sorts of opportunities that I really passionately believe we ought to be pursuing.
The only thing I'd add to that is that we need to get a sense of the scale of the opportunity, I think, to make this feel a bit more real to people. And so Annabelle, who's behind the scenes tonight, and I have been trying to do some numbers around this so that, for example, we have a sense of the scale of the potential value that could come from joining up some data sets in this way.
Amanda or Jamie, do you want to come in on this one? So there's another question for Diane which relates to this, which is about data being unbundled on platforms. And the question is, do we need actually a new set of institutions to manage the balance between privacy and data access? Should that be regulated, or actually is it some other kind of institution that doesn't yet exist?
I'm not sure of the answer to this. There are some parts of this that existing regulators could do. And I gave the example in my talk of the competition authorities, and they are doing a certain amount of this for market entry reasons, to keep the markets contestable. But I suspect there isn't a single answer. And this picks up on your previous question, Tanya. I think we're still grappling for the right, or for Jamie's comments for that matter, the right kinds of institutions to start handling all of this. So is it regulators? Is it new regulators? Should the regulators combine, or should we think about new collective institutions, the kind of institutional innovations that we saw in the last industrial revolution with mutuals and trade unions and so on? And so I'm afraid for whoever answered the question, I just don't have a single compelling answer to that one.
Jamie, from your perspective, do we need new institutions for this? Do we have the regulators, but just not the regulation?
Well, we definitely need innovation in regulation, and I suppose it can take one of two forms. Either you take institutions that already exist and you try to evolve and develop their capacities. So for instance, the British government just now, the UK government, is looking at using Ofcom, the existing broadcast regulator, as the putative regulator of social media platforms. That will require some retooling and some hiring and some reskilling, but they're not inventing a new regulator. Alternatively, though, I think there will be times where we have to just be bold and conjure new regulatory institutions into being. I mean, we've done it in the last few decades or so with information commissioners and the like, and every regulatory body has to be born sometime. And if there are not ones that can meet the current needs, then we should be bold about it. And I think the boldness is the important thing here. I mean, if we really do think that we're living in a transitional era, that this is a time of profound and systematic change in the way that we live together, then we shouldn't be surprised that we're going to need some new laws and some new institutions to try and catch up with it. So I think what you're going to have is a mixture of evolution of things we already have, and yes, where necessary, and the competition authority is another good one, a good example that Diane already mentioned. But we will probably need new ones too. Not a particularly elegant answer, but in a sense, it's the last question. I think you have to identify what you want to achieve with a regulatory structure, and then you can design the best institutions in order to implement it.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so I think to that point, Jamie, we should ask what this is for. And I understood your position to be that we should have more accountability, these companies. And I'm on board with that. I think we ought to find ways to hold these companies responsible. But just the fact of the administrative state, at least I'm more familiar with the United States, it involves setting standards and having sort of legal regulations, the compliance with which leaves private actors in the clear. And I think that's not necessarily going to work for at least the digital power that I've been talking about. I mean, as you were saying, these people are designing rules. They're designing rules for us. And so what you're asking regulators to do is design rules for the people that are designing rules for us. And so it seems to me like it's a fundamentally different problem of regulation here. It's not like regulating pollution levels on the part of companies, or even regulating the content that's broadcast on TV. What you need to regulate is the design of platforms that are enabling and empowering people to do a totally unpredictable and infinite amount of things. So it would be surprising to me if the best way to hold them accountable were with ex ante rules, unless those ex-ante rules were sort of vague standards, the way Sam was explaining earlier, so that the accountability is built into the potential to hold people accountable for particular judgments they make is built in to the vagueness of the standard. So I think that's the kind of thing we need to be exploring, just because what these companies are doing is so new.
Can I jump in there, Tanya? I mean,
Yeah,
Amanda, I agree. I think it's partly, we can conceptualize the problem in a number of ways. When you're trying to govern a social media platform, for instance, are you trying to govern or regulate the design and the engineering and the architecting? If that's so, then as that analogical language suggests, then it is like things we already regulate. We regulate how architects work. We regulate how engineers work. We regulate how bridges are designed and the like. And so you could, for instance, have a system which requires major social media platforms to have reasonable systems in place to reduce the flow and visibility of harmful misinformation, or reasonable systems in place to prevent foreign interference in the political process, or reasonable systems in place to mitigate the harmful effects of synthetic or inauthentic coordinated activity. And of course, what reasonable systems look like is something that is going to have to be hammered out in the courts. But there are millions of areas of law in which reasonableness is the test. And what you do is you develop a body of law over time, which you begin to be able to identify what falls on the right side of the line and what falls on the wrong side of the line. And it's all incredibly imperfect and imprecise in some ways. But the difficulty of the challenge, I'm not sure it is a unique challenge governing what technologists do. And by the way, sometimes you will just have, won't you? You'll just have hard rules. You may not use certain categories of data in certain ways. And if you do, you will face the following sanctions. So you're right that we need to, when you actually apply this kind of analysis to the way that administrative states currently work just now, it does seem rather daunting. We struggle to regulate much less complex industries than this. And as Diane says, it's not even just one industry to begin with. But I see that as the challenge rather than a kind of hurdle to be circumvented.
So on the theme of reasonableness, I'm going to jump in here to make sure that everyone can leave on the hour. Thank you to each of our panelists for such a fantastic conversation. I think that we could continue this conversation for many hours to come. And thinking about it, we've been discussing the data regulation topics, the platform regulation topics that we currently know exist. But there are so many issues to come in the coming months and years that I think we haven't even scratched the surface of yet. So many more conversations to come, no doubt. So it just remains for me to thank each of our panelists for their fantastic contributions. I also want to thank Rebecca Leam at the Bennett Institute for her fantastic work in putting this event together. Thank you to our audience for the many interesting questions. I'm happy we were able to come to some of them, but there were many more that we didn't quite make it to. Please do follow the conversation on the Bennett Institute and State Up websites, on our Twitter and LinkedIn feeds, and of course also subscribe to our newsletters if you'd like to keep up to date with what we are up to. And it just remains for me to thank you all and wish you a very good evening.